Anne Boleyn always steps out of the fog of history as a figure both alluring and terrifying. And perhaps the reason she continues to haunt the imagination 5 centuries later is not because she was beautiful enough to bend a kingdom to her will, but because she was the kind of woman who unsettled everyone around her, brilliant yet branded a witch, strong yet painted as a temptress, courageous yet executed like a traitor. When I first dug through the brittle pages written about Anne and Mary Boleyn, it felt as though I had opened a door into a room where centuries of venomous gossip had settled like a fine layer of dust, coating every story, every detail, every breath they ever took. People called Anne a homewrecker, a sorceress, the woman who seduced Henry and dragged England away from the true faith. Mary was dismissed as foolish, naive, a plaything tossed aside by powerful men. But if you brush away all these accusations, the way you brush ash from a smoldering ember, and you see the truth, they were simply 2 women trying to survive in a court where power was always hungry and men held every blade. From the few scraps of evidence that survived, we can imagine Anne and Mary growing up in the early years of the 16th century, a world where the birth of a boy was recorded with pride, and the birth of a girl with barely a shrug. They were daughters of Thomas Boleyn, a gifted diplomat who believed that intelligence could lift a family higher than bloodline alone ever could. Despite the era's indifference toward educating girls, Thomas insisted that his daughters learn more than embroidery and etiquette. They were raised in Kent, at Hever Castle, surrounded by dark woods, quiet streams, and stone corridors where every footstep echoed like a whisper, warning them that the world outside was ruled by the unpredictable appetite of a king. What fascinated me most when I first read about them was the subtle contrast between the sisters Mary, softer, gentler, easily liked, Anne sharp, edged, quick-witted, carrying a presence that made people look twice. Mary might have been the elder, or maybe not. No one is entirely sure, because no one thought it important enough to record. That was the destiny of women. Then their births already half erased, the moment they happened. But everyone agreed on one point. Anne shone dangerously bright. She was clever to the point of insolence, bold in word and thought, moving forward, as if she had been born to walk through fire without fear of burning. The beginning of their story is steeped in an atmosphere both dazzling and suffocating. The Tudor court was a stage where beauty could open every door yet also sentence you to ruin, where a smile could lift a family into power, and a single misstep could toss you into disgrace. Henry Tudor, crowned in the year 1509, was a king who devoured admiration, feared defiance, and believed desire was a force that justified any decision. He was the kind of man who could change the religion of a nation simply because his heart demanded it. And no emperor nor pope could stop him. Anne and Mary grew up under this shadow, in a world where ambition and lust were twisted together so tightly that no one could tell them apart. When I think about the opening chapter of their lives, I always feel the tension of a world balanced between brilliance and danger. These girls lived in a court where men could lift you to a throne at dawn and send you to a dungeon by dusk, where every whisper could turn into a weapon, where a woman's body was often the roadway her family used to climb toward influence. The tragedy is that neither Anne nor Mary was ever allowed to simply be herself. If they were used, they were foolish. If they refused to be used, they were arrogant. If they were loved, they were witches. If abandoned, they were jokes. In that cruel landscape, the most remarkable thing is that their names survived at all, strong enough that half a millennium later, we still tell their stories. Looking back on those years, the Boleyn sisters had nothing guaranteed except their minds, their appearance, and their luck. Their family was not powerful enough to be untouchable nor insignificant enough to be ignored. Ambition was their inheritance. And ambition would be the very thing that dragged them into the center of a storm that would change English history forever. When I rewrite this first part of their tale, it always feels like stepping through the first doorway of a long Tudor tragedy, a tragedy not born from blood and steel, but from glances, rumors, and the weight of expectations placed on two young women who had no idea that one would lose her head and the other would fade from the world like the moon sinking at dawn. Anne's world widened the moment she stepped beyond England, as though crossing the channel peeled away the quiet layers of her girlhood and exposed her to a brilliance that changed her forever. When her father arranged her placement at the court of Margaret of Austria in the year 1513, he was not merely sending a daughter abroad, he was placing her in the center of European culture, where music, politics, philosophy, etiquette, ambition, and elegance danced together, like flames rising from the same fire. I always picture Anne walking into that world with wide, observant eyes, absorbing everything the way noble women spoke softly, yet commanded entire rooms. How art and diplomacy intertwined. How intelligence was not hidden, but displayed like a precious jewel. Margaret recognized Anne instantly, not as a child to be molded, but as a mind to be sharpened. And under her care, Anne began to understand that a woman's influence did not need a crown to be real. Meanwhile, Mary remained in England, living the life expected of a well-born girl. Embroidery, polite conversation, waiting for a suitable marriage. Her path was softer, lined with familiar faces and predictable duties, yet a subtle current of resentment surely ran beneath the surface. Because the world had chosen Anne for brilliance and left Mary with the quieter corner of the room, the contrast between them became clearer every year. Anne's energy, her quick wit, her curiosity that never slowed. Mary's gentleness, her willingness to bend, her desire for harmony rather than recognition. But Mary's quiet world fractured first. In the year 1514, both sisters were selected to accompany Princess Mary Tudor to France for her marriage to King Louis. Only Mary made the journey. Because Anne was still in Margaret's household, far from the whirlwind awaiting her sister. The French court was nothing like England. It shimmered with risk and seduction, a place where beauty was both currency and trap. Mary stepped into that glittering space, unprepared for its dangers. When Louis died just 3 months after the wedding, and Francois ascended the throne, Mary found herself under the gaze of a king known for charming and consuming women without hesitation. She did not chase him, yet gossip would forever say she welcomed him. The truth lies somewhere in the space where power masks desire when a ruler beckons. Consent is a fragile word. Anne eventually joined Mary in France. But by the time she arrived, the sisters no longer walked side by side. They occupied different worlds within the same palace. Mary was marked by whispers, treated with polite distance, whereas Anne moved through chambers filled with poets, thinkers, and powerful women who understood how to twist politics from behind silk curtains. France was a furnace for Anne, forging her into something rare, a woman who could smile sweetly while calculating the temperature of a room. A woman who'd learned that charm and strategy could be woven like threads in the same tapestry. The French style clung to her permanently: the way she dressed, the way she spoke, the way she tilted her head as if she saw further than everyone else. Mary's time there, by contrast, vanished into silence. She slipped out of the French record for nearly 5 years, dissolving into speculation. Some believe she was removed to a noble household to repair her reputation. Others think she simply faded from a court where the king's interest had already turned elsewhere. When she reappeared in England on the 4th of February, in the year 1520, it was as a bride. She married William Carey, in a ceremony attended by Henry himself. And in that single moment, her fate shifted again. The king noticed her, not with curiosity, but with intention. This is where the sisters' stories begin to bend toward one another, one rising with the glow of continental sophistication, the other being drawn into the gravity of Henry's desire. To become the mistress of a king was not romance. It was obligation wrapped in velvet. Mary was not a temptress, but a woman with no real choice. A woman swept under by a tide that no one, least of all she, could resist. Meanwhile, Anne, shaped by years of refinement, and returned to England, not as a girl but as something sharper, brighter, and far more dangerous to a court built on predictable women. What fascinates me about this part of their lives is the quiet symmetry of it all. Mary entering the king's orbit just as Anne was learning how power truly worked. Both unaware that their separate paths were curving toward the same storm, their stories did not run parallel, they spiraled, tightening, drawing them back to the place where ambition, passion, and danger would fuse into the tragedy that history has never forgotten. Anne's return to England carried with it a kind of electricity, the subtle crackle that enters a room before a storm finally breaks. She had spent nearly 7 years breathing in the sophistication of France, absorbing the way women there moved like shadows and wielded influence like a whispered spell. And when she stepped once again onto English soil, the court was not ready for her. The Tudor world was still a stiff, predictable creature, built on silks and sermons, and the quiet obedience of women who knew better than to shine too brightly. Yet here came Anne, with her French poise, her quick tongue, her sharpened mind, and a presence that unsettled even those who pretended not to look. She went from unnoticed to unforgettable in the space of a breath, and the court, hungry for novelty, devoured her with its eyes, long before the king ever did. Mary, at this point, was already entangled in Henry's orbit, though the affair remained clandestine enough that gossip only whispered, never shouted. She had given birth to children whose paternity was quietly debated, though no one dared push the matter too far. Henry, in his usual fashion, admired her briefly, then allowed his interest to cool. That was the rhythm of his desire, fiery at first, then fading as soon as another flame appeared on the horizon. But Mary's situation was dangerous in a way she might not have fully grasped. Being the former lover of a king was like carrying a lit taper through a dry forest. Every step risked a spark. Every glance could be misinterpreted. And in a court where envy sat beside every noblewoman like a jeweled companion, Mary's position was far from secure. Anne's arrival disrupted all of this. The contrast between the sisters sharpened, almost painfully so. Mary was the gentle ripple on the surface of a lake. Anne was the stone thrown into its center. She made people react. Some admired her. Others feared her. Many disliked her instantly, but no one ignored her. She carried France in her gestures, in the tilt of her head. In the bold way, she met a man's gaze without lowering her eyes. English women whispered that she was too foreign. Englishmen whispered that she was too captivating. And somewhere in the middle of that chorus, Henry began to notice her. It did not happen immediately. Despite the popular myth that Henry fell for Anne the moment she walked into the room, that version of the story is far too clean, far too romantic for a king whose heart was shaped more by vanity than devotion. In truth, it took years in which Anne danced, laughed, sang, conversed, and cleverly avoided every trap laid for women in her position. She was admired by courtiers, pursued by noblemen, nearly engaged once or twice. And each time she stepped back, just before being caught, it was as if she sensed that the life she was meant to live had not yet arrived, that her destiny sat coiled in the shadows like a serpent waiting to strike. Henry's interest in Anne flared around the year 1526, at a time when his affair with Mary had long since cooled into a forgettable ember. The king was bored of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, bored of the predictable cycles of court life, bored of mistresses who sighed when he wanted them to laugh. And then he saw Anne, sharp as a needle, soft as velvet, wholly unlike any woman England had yet produced. There was something intoxicating in the way she refused to bend to him. Henry had spent his life surrounded by women taught to kneel. Yet here was one who remained standing. His pursuit began with gifts, jewels, furs, brooches, ribbons all returned, unopened. Then came letters, dripping with longing, filled with declarations of torment and devotion. Anne read them with care, perhaps with curiosity, perhaps with strategy. But she did not surrender. She held Henry at arm's length, refusing to become another fleeting amusement, refusing to let her heart become her weakness the way Mary's had. And Henry, unused to denial, became obsessed, his desire swelling from fascination into possession. The court, always eager for drama, buzzed like a hive disturbed. Some women mocked Anne quietly for her boldness. Others envied her growing allure. Men watched her with admiration tinged with caution. And Mary, caught in the strangest position of all, stood at the edge of the stage, watching her sister enter the same fire she once stood near, but with a very different outcome. History often paints Mary as jealous or bitter, but I suspect her reaction was more complicated, a blend of fear for Anne's future, shame for her own past, and the sinking realization that the king, who once held her life in his hands, now barely recalled the shape of her face. Anne, perhaps seeing Mary's fading place at court, perhaps remembering the whispers that had followed her sister through France. I did something quietly defiant. She refused the throne of mistress. She would not give her body to the king unless he gave her something far greater, the crown. It was not the request of a seductress. It was the demand of a woman who understood the cost of being used and discarded. She had watched Mary live that life. She would not do the same. This was the moment that turned the fate of nations. Henry, inflamed by desire and insulted by resistance, began to imagine a world without Catherine. A world where Anne stood beside him as queen. A world where his hunger for a male heir could finally be satisfied. And so, a king who once stood firmly within the Catholic faith now prepared to tear his marriage apart, tear the country from Rome, and tear the lives of everyone around him into pieces, simply because Anne Boleyn had learned, somewhere in the glittering courts of Europe, how to say no. The storm had begun to gather, and neither Anne nor Mary yet understood that they were standing at its center. Henry's desire, once stirred, rarely drifted back into calm. And by the time the year 1527 crept over England, the king's obsession with Anne had hardened into something far more dangerous than longing. It became necessity. It became fixation. It became the kind of hunger that bends the world around it until everything lost. Faith, family, loyalty must twist out of shape just to feed it. Anne had not meant to become the axis of a political earthquake. But the moment she refused to be Henry's mistress, she lit a fuse running straight into the heart of Europe. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's queen for nearly 2 decades, was still very much alive. She had stood beside him through wars, pregnancies, losses, coronations, 20 years of shared fate. Yet Henry now looked at her with the cold appraisal of a man convinced that God himself had turned against his marriage. Only one child survived their long union, Princess Mary. And Henry's terror of leaving the Tudor throne without a male heir had begun to gnaw at him. Catherine insisted her marriage to his late brother Arthur had never been consummated. But Henry clung to the opposite belief, as if it were a divine message carved into stone that he had sinned by marrying her. And heaven was punishing him by withholding a son. Anne became the spark that ignited this crisis. Though she did not create it, she merely stood in a place where Henry's desperation could anchor itself. The king began crafting arguments, consulting scholars, pressuring clergy, and whispering to courtiers that England needed a queen, young enough, fertile enough, and destined enough to bear him a boy. Every whisper made Anne more visible, more envied, more hated. Women at court studied her with narrowed eyes, wondering how one girl could make a king rewrite scripture. Men debated whether she was enchantress or genius. Catherine's supporters sharpened their tongues and prayed for divine retribution. And Anne, caught between admiration and loathing, held her ground with a kind of trembling resolve, knowing that one misstep could send her plunging into ruin. During these years, exile and return shaped the sisters like hammer and anvil. Mary, already dismissed by Henry and living in the growing shadow of Anne's ascent, slipped further from the bright edges of court life. She had lost her husband, William Carey, to the deadly sweating sickness in the summer of 1528, leaving her with 2 small children and shockingly little protection. Poverty lurked around her more closely than status ever had. And yet, in a gesture that revealed something tender beneath Anne's ambition, she intervened. She persuaded Henry to grant Mary a pension. She took custody of Mary's young son, Henry Carey, so the burden would not crush her sister completely. The two women, so often placed in rivalry by history, shared a brief moment of genuine sisterhood, fragile, flickering, soon swallowed again by the widening canyon between their lives. Anne, meanwhile, hovered at the brink of becoming queen, yet could not step forward. The annulment Henry sought required permission from the Pope, who refused outright. Catherine's nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in Europe, and no pontiff dared offend him. Henry's frustration bloomed into rage. For the first time, he began to consider what once seemed unimaginable, that he might break England away from Rome entirely. The thought frightened even him, but Anne's presence hardened his resolve. She became symbol, promise, justification. Her intelligence whispered new possibilities. Her refusal fed his determination. And Henry, who had been raised to believe himself chosen by God, came to believe that tearing down the authority of the Pope was not rebellion, it was destiny. This dangerous transformation unsettled every corner of the kingdom. Cardinal Wolsey, once Henry's most powerful advisor, saw his influence dissolving beneath Anne's rising tide. Wolsey had misused her, dismissing her as another temporary flame in the king's life. He failed to realize that Anne had already entwined herself into Henry's deepest insecurities and greatest hopes. As the annulment continued to stagnate, Anne blamed Wolsey for his failures. She whispered to Henry that the cardinal no longer served him. She pressed her disappointment into the king's ear until Wolsey's fall became inevitable. Stripped of office, accused of treason, Wolsey died on the road to London before he could even face trial. His collapse sent a message through the court like a cold wind. Anne was no longer merely the king's desire. She was a rising force whose enemies suffered swift punishment. Yet power never arrives without cost. Anne knew she was pushing against the limits of what any woman in England had ever been allowed to do. She was influencing policy, shaping religious thought, and navigating political labyrinths that men were trained for from childhood. Every decision made in her favor echoed through Europe. Every step forward tightened the noose of expectation around her neck. And still she walked on, possessed by a belief, perhaps naive, perhaps prophetic, that becoming queen would secure her place, silence her enemies, and grant her the stability she had never known. Mary watched from the edges, her life shrinking as Anne's ballooned. The sisters were now bound by a thread, stretched so thin it might snap at any moment. Mary's fall had been quiet. Anne's rise was thunderous. Yet both were tethered to the same dangerous man. And both were already paying for it. One through invisibility, the other through scrutiny sharp enough to wound. England itself began to split like stone under frost. Friends turned enemies. Families chose sides. The court vibrated with tension, every conversation laced with caution. And at the center of this trembling kingdom stood Anne, brilliant, ambitious, flawed, determined, stepping closer and closer to a throne built on broken vows and a dangerous promise that she would give Henry the son he believed God owed him. Anne's world unfolded into triumph, with a brilliance so blinding that it disguised, even from her own eyes, the soft cracks forming beneath her feet. When the long battle to dissolve Henry's marriage to Catherine finally tipped in his favor, the kingdom shifted like a great beast turning in its sleep. By the early months of the year 1533, Henry had done what no English king before him had dared. He tore the crown away from Rome and placed it upon his own head as the supreme authority of England's church. The old world fell behind him like a discarded cloak, and Anne stepped into the new one as if she had been destined for it. She had waited for years, endured the venom of courtiers, the hatred of Catherine's loyalists, the whispers that she was a seductress who had bewitched a king, and now she would be queen. Their wedding was almost secret, a hushed ritual carried out in the shadows of Whitehall. Far from the eyes of those who believed Catherine still held the rightful place, the king was technically still married to his first wife. So discretion was not merely convenient, it was necessary. I often imagine Anne in that moment, standing beside the most powerful man in England, aware that in choosing her, he had broken not only his vows, but the very foundations of the Christian order. She must have felt invincible. She must have felt unstoppable. But I suspect she also felt the faint tremor of fear, because no woman rises that far without sensing how far she can fall. When news spread of the marriage, the reaction from the people was cold, almost icy. Many despised her. Some called her usurper. Some called her witch. Some whispered that England's disasters plague, bad harvests, storms were punishments from God for Henry's betrayal of Catherine. In every insult hurled at Anne, I hear the echo of a truth that still haunts history. Powerful women are the easiest targets for the anger of a nation. Yet for Anne, the days that followed must have felt like the peak of a mountain she had spent a decade climbing. She was pregnant, already carrying a child she believed would be England's long-awaited prince. Henry, in love with the idea of her, as much as with the woman herself, prepared the most extravagant coronation the country had seen in generations. The celebration in June of that year lasted 4 days, the capital transforming into a river of pageants, plays, music, and ceremony. Barges lined the Thames in procession. Noblemen bowed, Crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder, not necessarily to cheer her, but unable to resist the spectacle. As she rode through London on her litter of silver and cloth of gold, it must have felt as though the entire world had finally given her the recognition she had been denied for so long. And yet, beneath all the shining fabric and thunderous applause of royal trumpets, something darker hummed. The hatred of the people did not fade. Henry's devotion, though fierce, carried an undertone of desperation. He did not only want Anne, he wanted what she promised him. A future. Salvation from the fear that his dynasty might crumble. In this sense, Anne's crown was less a jewel and more a contract carved into metal. Its edges glittered, its weight crushed. Meanwhile, Mary reappeared at court for a brief, inconfortable moment. Her sister's coronation should have been a time of celebration, a renewed bond forged in triumph. Instead, Mary walked through the halls like a ghost from Anne's past. She served briefly as one of Anne's ladies, but even as she stood near the throne, her presence drew little warmth. The world saw her as a faded echo of the king's former desire, an embarrassment to be ignored. In a letter written later, Mary confessed that all the world did set so little by me. I imagine her watching Anne, surrounded by diamonds and power, and understanding with a kind of weary clarity that she no longer had a place in the court's glittering machinery. Her sister had risen high, and Mary had slipped into the shadows. Then came September of 1533. The moment Anne had been waiting for. The moment England expected to shape its destiny. She went into labor. The court held its breath. Henry prepared to greet a prince, but when the child was placed into her arms, it was a girl tiny, fierce, red-haired, and utterly unacceptable to a king who had broken the world to create her. Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen of England. But in that moment, Henry saw only failure. That birth marked an invisible fracture in Anne's life. The point where hope turned into tension, where Henry's adoration began to sour. The people whispered that God had rejected Anne. Catherine's supporters celebrated in secret, insisting the child's sex was divine justice. Henry smiled and cooed over his daughter in public. But deep inside, disappointment rooted itself like rot beneath a painted wall. Anne tried again. She tried to appease Henry's moods, to remind him of her wit and charm, to hold his attention with the fire that had once captivated him. But a queen is never allowed to be merely a wife. She must be symbol. Promise. Guarante. The birth of a daughter meant Anne was suddenly none of those things, and court politics sharpened like blades around her. Every miscarriage was interpreted as a flaw in her character. Every argument with Henry was magnified. Every moment of temper became the fuel for her enemies, who gathered in the shadows and waited. Her personality, once admired for its boldness, now irritated Henry. Anne was not meek like Catherine. She was not quiet. She did not turn a blind eye to Henry's wandering eye. She confronted him openly, furiously, sometimes even in front of courtiers. The king who once adored her fire now recoiled from its heat. England had reshaped itself around Anne, but Henry's love began to reshape itself around someone else, a gentle lady named Jane Seymour, whose softness made Anne look sharp, whose submission made Anne look stubborn, whose silence made Anne's brilliance seem like noise. Anne's triumph, so radiant only months before, now flickered like a candle exposed to wind. The crown she had fought for, bled for, waited for, suddenly felt colder on her head. Her power was real, but its foundation, Henry's desire, was weakening. The ground beneath her was shifting again. And this time, It was shifting toward ruin. Anne's crown had always been a bargain, struck with a restless, unpredictable fate. And by the time the year 1534 settled over England, that bargain began tightening around her like an invisible snare. The court, which had once felt electrified by her presence, now seemed to hold its breath whenever she entered a room. The same boldness that once drew Henry toward her now pushed him away. The same brilliance that elevated her above every woman of her age now became the torch her enemies used to search for cracks in her armor. And worst of all, the promise for which Henry had broken a queen, a church, and half of Europe, the promise of a male heir, remained unfulfilled. Anne's second pregnancy should have been her redemption. A chance to restore Henry's faith in both her body and her destiny. She walked through the corridors with a confidence almost defiant, showing her swelling belly as if daring the world to doubt her again. The entire kingdom held its breath, and Anne held hers as well, imagining the moment she would place a son into Henry's eager arms. But life in the Tudor court was not kind to hope. In the cold months early that year, she miscarried a child. Henry desperately wanted a boy, and something in Henry cracked. The king, who had once rewritten scripture to marry her, now looked at her as though she were a door that refused to open no matter how many times he turned the key. Their quarrels grew sharper. Anne's fiery nature, which once intoxicated him, now made him feel cornered, criticized, exposed. She had spent years outmaneuvering rivals, navigating diplomatic storms, and holding her own against the king. But she could not fight the basic truth that clung to her like a curse. She was not giving him a son. This failure was not just personal, it was political, spiritual, cosmic. Henry believed God spoke through the womb, and Anne's womb spoke in silence. Every miscarriage became a divine sign in his mind, a whisper that he had made a mistake, that God was displeased, that destiny had been defied. Anne, feeling the ground slip beneath her, I tried to hold Henry close with charm, wit, and fire. But fire was precisely what frightened him now. He was aging, growing heavier, more insecure, increasingly suspicious of everyone around him. And in this storm of fear, Anne's sharp intelligence made her look like a threat. It was during this fragile time that Mary reappeared in Anne's life, carrying a secret that would detonate the last fragile thread between them. Mary had fallen in love, not with a nobleman, not with a court advisor, but with William Stafford, a simple soldier with no fortune, no title, nothing to offer her except affection. And she married him for love, without permission from her family or her queen. In the Tudor world, this was nothing short of mutiny. When Mary returned to court, quietly pregnant and quietly content, Anne's reaction was not joy but fury. To her, Mary's marriage was a betrayal not only of family ambition, but of the fragile order Anne had fought to build. Anne had clawed her way to the throne with strategy and sacrifice. And here was her sister, throwing away her noble status for affection, a luxury Anne believed she no longer had the right to even dream about. Mary's bold act only deepened Anne's isolation. If even her sister did not understand the cost of queenship, who could? Anne banished Mary from court without hesitation. There would be no allowance, no protection, no soft landing. The sisters who once walked the same halls as girls would never stand together again. And Mary, hurt but unbroken, stepped into obscurity with the quiet dignity of someone who had finally chosen her own fate. But as one sister faded, another enemy sharpened his knives. Thomas Cromwell, the architect behind Henry's religious revolution, had once been Anne's ally. But alliances at the Tudor court had the lifespan of a winter rose, and Anne made a fatal mistake. She confronted Cromwell publicly. She criticized him through sermons preached in her name, accusing him of misusing money seized from the monasteries. She challenged his reforms. She questioned his motives. She made him look small. And in a court built on ego, this was deadlier than treason. Cromwell understood something Anne had not yet admitted to herself. Henry was slipping away from her. His attention had begun drifting toward Jane Seymour, whose gentle silence cast Anne's fierceness into harsh relief. Cromwell knew that a queen without the king's heart was a queen without protection. And so he began to weave a web that Anne could not see. Threads spun from gossip, envy, resentment, and the king's growing desire to be free of a woman who reminded him daily of his own failures. Anne, sensing danger but unable to locate its source, it did what she always had. She fought. She argued. She pleaded. She confronted Henry about Jane. She pushed too hard, too openly, too bravely. Every time she tried to pull Henry back toward her, he drifted further away, like a tide abandoning the shore. And when she became pregnant again, her last desperate hope, fear and pressure wrapped around her like iron bands. She miscarried once more, this time in the presence of emotional anguish, possibly after discovering Henry's attachment to Jane Seymour. This loss, in Henry's mind, was the final omen. God's judgment had been delivered. Anne's womb had spoken for the last time. And Cromwell, ever the opportunist, stepped forward to offer Henry the escape he craved. Anne's downfall was no longer a question of if, but how soon. And the whisper of ruin had already begun, its slow crawl down the cold stones of the Tudor court. Anne did not fall in a single moment. Like a stone dropped into a river, she fell the way great buildings collapse, first with tiny cracks invisible to the eye, then with tremors underfoot, and finally, with a roar that seemed sudden only to those who never noticed the warning signs. By the time the year 1536 dawned over England, Anne's fate was already sealed in the quiet places of the court, whispered into existence by men who smiled in her presence and sharpened their knives once she turned away. Her greatest enemy was not Henry's cooling desire, nor the jealous eyes of courtiers, nor even her own miscarriages. Her greatest enemy was Thomas Cromwell, a man who had learned to survive by eliminating anyone who threatened his path, even a queen. Cromwell understood Henry better than anyone alive. He knew the king's fears, his vanity, his longing for a son, his desperation to be right in the eyes of God. And he recognized that Anne, clever as she was, had misjudged her new reality. She believed that intelligence could save her. She believed that the years she spent capturing Henry's heart would protect her now. But intelligence becomes dangerous when it embarrasses powerful men. And a king's old love becomes poison when it stands between him and his new desire. Jane Seymour had entered Henry's orbit with a calculated softness. She spoke little. She bowed her head often. She refused gifts until they were offered twice, 3 times. As though she needed to be persuaded, her silence became her greatest weapon because Henry, exhausted by Anne's fiery temper and unyielding wit, found comfort in a woman who did not argue, did not demand, did not remind him of his failures. The contrast was too sharp, too easy, too tempting. Anne, carrying the grief of another miscarriage, saw this shift with gut-deep terror. She confronted Henry. She scolded him. She clung to him. And with every attempt to pull him back, She pushed him further away. This was when Cromwell moved. He began stitching together the accusation that would destroy her not with facts, but with convenience. A queen could not simply be set aside without reason. England had already endured one annulment that shook the foundation of Europe. This time, Henry needed something stronger, darker, something that would not just free him but cleanse him of guilt. Cromwell understood this chillingly well. So he built a narrative made of shadows and rumor, adultery, treason, depravity, even incest. He chose the men carefully, 5 courtiers who were already his enemies, including George Boleyn, Anne's own brother. The genius and cruelty of this plan lay in its symmetry. By destroying Anne, Cromwell could also destroy every man who opposed him. Anne, unaware of the net closing around her, I tried to keep her place at court with the only tools she had ever used: her charm, her intelligence, her deep belief that Henry still loved some version of her. She appeared at court events, held herself with dignity, and forced her voice to be steady, even as whispers curled through every hall. But there were moments, small cracks in her composure, when despair flickered across her face like a candle threatened by a draft. She knew she was losing Henry. What she did not yet know was that she was losing her life. The blow fell swiftly. On the 2nd day of May, 1536, Anne was arrested at Greenwich and taken by barge along the Thames to the Tower of London, the same route she had taken 3 years earlier for her coronation. The difference was not just the silence. It was the air itself, thick with finality. When she stepped onto Tower Green, she whispered, "Is this where I shall die?" It was not melodrama. It was prophecy. Inside the tower, Anne unraveled. Witness later described her as trembling, rambling, swinging wildly between laughter and tears, state of mind Cromwell would use to paint her as unstable, sinful, hysterical, alone in her cold chambers. She tried to trace the path that led her here, but it was like trying to track the roots of a tree buried deep beneath the earth. She spoke of her innocence. She mentioned her little neck, a grim acknowledgement of what awaited her. She prayed, she wept, and she waited. The trials began within days, swift and merciless. The 5 accused men, Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and George Boleyn, were tried first. Smeaton, the only one low enough in rank to be tortured or threatened with it, confessed under pressure. The others maintained their innocence to the end. Their defense did not matter. The verdict had been decided before the charges were drafted. Anne and George were tried on the 15th day of May. The courtroom brimmed with nobles, many eager to witness the destruction of the woman whose rise had unsettled England. The charges were grotesque adultery with multiple men, treason against the king, incest with her own brother. The accusations were built on impossible scenarios, trysts occurring on days when Anne was pregnant, sick, or not even present at court. Logic did not matter. The story mattered. The story needed to be monstrous enough to justify her death. Anne defended herself with remarkable poise. She denied every charge directly, calmly, even gracefully. But she knew, even as she spoke, that the trial was a performance staged for an audience already persuaded. When the guilty verdict came, she did not scream or faint. She stood still, as though her body had run out of ways to react to the cruelty of men. Her execution was scheduled for the 19th day of May. Henry, in what he considered an act of mercy, ordered a swordsman from France, a clean, swift death rather than the brutal hacking of an English axe. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps, in some twisted way, it was affection. In the tower, Anne prepared for death with a steadiness that astonished even her jailers. She prayed through the night. She forgave her enemies. She never cursed Henry, and on the morning of her execution, she walked out into the sunlight. Slender, pale, elegant, as though she were stepping into a new world rather than leaving this one. The fall was complete. The end was inevitable. The queen who had risen on the wings of brilliance was now standing on the cold stones where traitors died, waiting for the flash of steel that would erase her from Henry's life forever. Anne's final days unfolded with a quiet, surreal slowness, as though time itself hesitated to carry out the fate already written for her. The Tower of London, which had once stood as a symbol of her triumphant ascent, its cold stones echoing with celebration the day she arrived, as queen now swallowed her whole. The same walls that once held her coronation procession's shimmering reflections now pressed in on her like a tomb constructed in advance. It is impossible not to feel the brutal symmetry of it. Anne entered the Tower as a crowned hope for England, and returned to it as a condemned woman awaiting death. No tragedy in Tudor history carries such cruel, poetic balance. Henry, meanwhile, moved through these days with a mixture of impatience and calculated detachment. The man who once begged for Anne's attention, who wrote her letters thick with longing, who ripped apart England's religious identity for her now, avoided speaking her name. He spent these days preparing for his future, not mourning his past. Jane Seymour had slipped into the king's confidence with devastating ease, her quiet demeanor serving as a balm to his bruised pride. Henry would visit her almost daily, a fact whispered through the court with both shock and resignation. Anne's living body was still locked in the Tower, yet her successor was already being positioned like a queen in waiting. The message was unmistakable. Anne was no longer the storm Henry clung to. She was the storm he wanted to escape. Inside the Tower, Anne weathered long hours of solitude, broken only by prayer, a sudden burst of speech, and the haunting uncertainty of how her story would end. She had been told she would face execution by sword rather than acts of mercy. So unusual it felt like its own kind of cruelty. Did Henry choose it out of lingering affection? Or was it simply because a swordsman's clean stroke would make England's transition to its next queen swifter, tedious, less macabre? These questions must have churned inside Anne's mind, rising like dark birds from the deepest parts of her fear. The Tower's lieutenant, Sir William Kingston, recorded her behavior with meticulous detail. She shifted between trembling despair and eerie serenity. At times she laughed a brittle, unnatural sound that echoed down the stone passages. At other moments she prayed quietly, her voice steady, her hands clasped with such intensity that her knuckles turned white. In rare flashes she became philosophical, speaking aloud about sin, innocence, fate, and how strangely life can twist a person's path until they no longer recognize the ground they stand upon. Kingston noted that she seemed prepared for death one minute and terrified of it. The next, a human reaction in an inhuman situation. Outside the Tower, Cromwell's web tightened. He needed the people, the nobles, the clergy, and Europe itself to accept Anne's execution not as a whim of the king but as justice delivered. He released fragments of rumor, hints of depravity, suggestions of witchcraft, the threads of fabricated scandal, each whisper weaving into a narrative of corruption so outrageous that the public could hardly refuse to believe it. Anne had always faced hostility from the English people, but now the hostility became a weapon, Those who never wanted her on the throne embraced these lies as vindication. Those who once feared her now rejoiced in her downfall. And those who had supported her grew silent, slipping away like shadows at dusk. Unwilling to tether themselves to a queen already marked for erasure, the condemned men Smeaton, Norris, Brereton, Weston, and George Boleyn were executed 2 days before Anne. Their deaths carved a jagged hole through the court. Not because anyone had loved them sincerely, but because their fall exposed the brutality of the machinery at work. Each man maintained his innocence except Smeaton, whose confession had been coerced. George was especially defiant, facing his death with a dignity so sharp it cut through Cromwell's fabricated case like a blade. But dignity, truth, and courage held no more weight than feathers in a storm designed to drown them. When Anne heard the tolling bells marking the deaths of the men condemned alongside her, the tower seemed to hush. It was as if every stone understood that her turn had come. Kingston wrote that she fell to her knees and prayed for their souls, her voice trembling but clear. She did not cry. She did not scream. Perhaps she was past the point where fear could reach her. Or perhaps she finally felt the quiet certainty of her fate settle inside her like cold water. Henry spent the evening dining with Jane Seymour. And so England stood poised at the edge of two worlds, the world Anne had reshaped with her ambition, and the world Henry now sought to rebuild without her. The queen whose existence had torn apart a marriage, a church, and the nation's unity had become, in the king's eyes, nothing more than an obstacle in the path of his new desire. Cromwell prepared the final stage. The Tower prepared the scaffold. The swordsmen, brought secretly from France, waited. The morning of the 19th day of May approached, and with it came the fragile, terrible quiet that always hangs before a death that will echo across centuries. Anne had risen as a force of nature, bold, brilliant, unstoppable, but now she would meet her end, as a woman kneeling on cold stone beneath a gray sky. The journey from coronation to execution was heartbreakingly short. A path measured not in years, but in the cruelty of a king's shifting heart. The morning of the 19th day of May arrived with a stillness so complete it felt unnatural, as though even the wind understood that something irreversible was about to unfold. Dawn did not break gently over the Tower of London. Instead, it crept in like a pall of spectator, lighting the scaffold plank by plank, board by board, until the stage was fully revealed for the final act of Anne Boleyn's life. There is a peculiar silence that precedes executions. A silence, saturated not with peace, but with expectation. And that morning, it hung over the tower like a shroud. Anne rose early. She dressed herself with the same deliberation she once used when preparing for court, choosing garments that conveyed dignity rather than despair. Her gown of dark, modest fabric, her ermine trimming, her headdress all carefully placed. Each piece a quiet declaration that even in death she would not bow to humiliation. As she prepared, Kingston observed a serenity in her that had eluded her in the earlier days of her imprisonment. Perhaps she had crossed through every circle of fear already. Perhaps she had made peace with the one truth no crown could protect her from. Or perhaps she simply understood that the way she met death would shape how history remembered her far more than the lies used to bring her there. Outside, a small crowd gathered, not the roaring multitudes that attended common executions, but a curated assembly of nobles, courtiers, officials, and guards. Cromwell ensured the audience was contained, manageable, easier to direct. A queen's death required control. It required choreography. It required precision. The French swordsmen waited, his weapon hidden beneath straw to prevent panic or spectacle before the proper moment. As Anne stepped out of the Queen's lodgings, she walked with a composure that startled those who watched her. She held her head high. Her steps were steady. If she felt her heart shaking inside her chest, she did not betray it, for a woman framed as hysterical, sinful, and unstable. And her dignity that morning dismantled every charge better than any courtroom speech could. She mounted the scaffold without faltering, arranging her skirts behind her with a practiced grace that reminded everyone she was, until this moment, their queen. When she turned to face the crowd, her eyes were bright, not with fear, but with a clarity born from knowing that the worst had already happened. Her voice carried over the morning air, soft, yet unmistakably steady. She did not accuse Henry. She did not curse her enemies. She did not declare her innocence, though she had spoken it before. Instead, she followed the ritual, expected of those condemned. She praised the king. She asked God to protect him. She prayed for the realm and for those who had condemned her. To some, these words were obedience. To others, strategy. To me, they read like the final assertion of control by a woman denied every other form of power. If she could not win justice, she could at least win the last word. When she knelt, her hands trembled for the first time. She removed her headdress, tucking her hair beneath a cap to clear the swordsman's path. "I have a little neck," she once remarked in the tower. A strange, brittle attempt at humor. Now those words echoed in chilling silence as she stretched her slender throat forward. Kingston tied a blindfold around her eyes. Though she asked for none, the swordsman stepped back, studying her posture, waiting for the small lull of breath he recognized in every condemned prisoner. Then came the trick, his one act of mercy. He called to his assistant, "Bring me the sword," though the blade was already hidden in his hand. Instinctively, Anne turned her head slightly toward the sound, and in that fraction of a moment, the swordsman struck, one clean movement, faster than thought, separating her head from her body with such precision that witnesses later swore she never even felt the pain. Her head fell before the crowd even gasped. The executioner lifted nothing. There was no grim parade of the head, no triumphant display. Cromwell had insisted on restraint. The body was quickly carried into the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. There was no coffin, no proper burial cloth. Her remains were placed in an arrow chest too small, too crude, and interred beneath the stones of a chapel floor. A Queen of England buried like a discarded thing. A life that had reshaped a nation ended without fanfare. Henry, at that exact hour, was preparing for marriage to Jane Seymour. By midday, he would announce his engagement. Within 11 days, he would make Jane his new queen, and when Elizabeth ascended the throne decades later, ruling longer and more brilliantly than any Tudor before her, history circled back. Anne Boleyn, the queen executed as a traitor, became the mother of England's greatest monarch. Mary, living quietly in the countryside. I never knew whether her sister thought of her in those final hours. She faded from the records, but survived the political carnage that consumed her siblings. She died peacefully in the year 1543, her children rising through the ranks of nobility, her lineage intertwining with the royal bloodlines she herself had once walked beside. In the end, the world that destroyed Anne Boleyn could not escape her. Her fall exposed the corruption of a king, the brutality of politics, the fragility of women's lives in the Tudor age. Her legacy, divided between triumph and tragedy, became a mirror held up to every generation that tried to judge her. And each time the mirror shifts, a new version of her emerges: victim, visionary, villain, martyr. Perhaps the truth is that she was all of them at once, because she was human in a world that allowed women no room for humanity. Her story ends on a scaffold, but it does not end in silence. It reverberates through Elizabeth's reign, through centuries of retellings, through every woman who has been loved and destroyed by the same hand. Anne Boleyn's last breath became the first spark of an era that would outlive every man who condemned her.